Hello again. So over here we have the second React application I created, which is an expense tracker. And the way it works is dashboard, which is your main page. You see a list of all your expenses, the amount in cents. So 100 means a dollar, and this is like the moment they're created at. So we have three, and we can filter these either by their date amount or their text. So if we search up, for example, ICE, only ice cream shows up. But if we add an extra E, none of the texts match, so nothing shows up. We could do the same thing for electricity. But if we spell it wrong, nothing shows up. And we can even do city because it's included in the characters. We could also filter it by date. So just because I created these, I know that this was created at March 29 or something. So if we filter it from, let's say, April 4th, only two expenses show up because these were created on or after April 4th. You can also sort by amount, and this just gives us which bills were most expensive from most expensive to least expensive. So here's our create expense page. This is how I created each expense. Description is the name, so we can say dinner, say 120, and this is like a note, it's optional, and we could say did not pay tip, waiter was bad, something like that. We could add it, and we could just make it on May 31st. Then we add the expense, and here it shows up. And we could also edit them. So if we realized, oh, you know what, I actually did pay a tip because that waiter was actually good, let's just not add a note. You can see it update. Now, one thing I still need to do on this is styling it, and I didn't really focus on styling because I focused on styling in the last application. And the second thing is storing everything in a database, which I'm going to do with Firebase later on. I just want to show you the working application so far. So unfortunately, if we click, and get help page is pretty basic if you're wondering. And this is all done using client-side routing. So it dynamically routes the page. It doesn't refresh the whole thing. It just sees which component changes, and based on the URL, it refreshes the page. So if we go to like create expense page, for example, we realize that the URL is /create, get help /help, and the individual expenses. This is basically an ID generated by the function UUID. So that's the route for that one. But as I was saying, my next step in this application is to store it on a database, most likely Firebase, because right now, if I do a Control-R and I refresh the whole page, none of the expenses show up because it's not stored in a database. Right now, I'm just gonna quickly run through a bit of the code I wrote to help build this application. So over here, we have our app.js file, which is our parent file, and we have our store. And the way a store works is it has a bunch of reducers, and then every time an action is dispatched, it goes to the store sends it to each reducer, and then the reducer with the matching switch case is run, and then whatever's returned from that reducer is the state of the application. So the store is basically stores a global state, kind of. So here we're rendering an app router. So if we go to app router, it's just the route of each of our paths. So / is our dashboard page, create is our create, expense page, edit is edit, and help is help. Not found page is if none of these match, it goes to the not found page. And we're using exact equals true, meaning that it must only be / to go to the dashboard page. If it wasn't, then /create would also render expense dashboard page because both of them include backslashes. So each of them render a component, and if we go to the individual components, I can show you that add expense page, you basically just add an expense and you push the route to the dashboard after you're done adding the expense, so it goes back to the home page. It exports the add expense page, like the class based component, and it connects it to the actions, which is map dispatch to props, but it doesn't connect it to the state. Next is our edit expense page. This is where we edit our expense. This is our expense dashboard page. There's our expense form. But what I was just doing last time was just explaining how each path in the app router renders a different component. So the backslash renders the expense dashboard page, and so on. So where I left off was explaining the add expense page. This just adds you to to add an expense, and then every time you add an expense, it just redirects you to the main page, which is by changing the route to this backslash, and then the backslash path route renders the dashboard page component. This is where we edit our expense page. Same thing. After you click the edit expense, it brings you back to the dashboard page. Our event handlers don't really need to explain too much of that. And this is where we export. This is where we export the edit expense page class-based component, and we connect it to the state and the actions it needs to dispatch. So it just needs to dispatch the actions as expense and the remove expense actions. And it's connected to, and map state to props connects it to the appropriate state that it needs to be connected to. Expense dashboard page just shows you all the expenses by rendering two subcomponents, which are expense list filters, which I'll explain later on, and the expense list. Expense form, basically every time you want to add an expense, this handles it. So if the description changes, it sets the state to the description, to the new description, so on with the rest of these event handlers. This is just like a regular expression handler, so it won't allow you to add any letters, more than 2 decimal points. More than 1 decimal point, more than 2 decimal places, so on. This is just like our inputs and our text areas. Expense list shows us all our expenses by rendering this expense list subcomponent, and it maps. It gives us the expense list item based on its key, and the key is its expense ID. And then it uses the spread operator to give it the rest of the state it needs to do so. So if we go to expense list item is just each of our expenses. So here's the name of the expense, how much it costs, and when it was created. Expense list filters just filters the expenses we have and just gives the user what they want to see. So if they set the date from like March 29 to April 29, they only see the expenses from that time. So every time something changes, it just calls the appropriate actions needed to do so. And the actions that do so are in expenses.js. Filters.js. So if we want to sort by amount, it's just called a sort by amount action. And then this gives the reducer the sort by amount switch case so that the appropriate state is returned. And I'll show you the reducers later. Same thing with our edit expenses. This is our expenses action. So every time we run an expense, this is what's run, and this is the switch case that goes to the expenses reducer. Our header, so yeah, I explained this. Our header is pretty basic, just titles and subtitles. Help page, also pretty basic, just like a dummy page. Our not found page, if none of the other routes match, it goes to this 404 page and it links you back to the home page. So you can click go home and you go back to the dashboard. Our reducers, here they are. With the switch cases, each of them are run and they return the appropriate state. This is for expenses and this is for our filters. That filters our data. So yes, and then we configure our store over here. So we combine, we make the store have 2 reducers. And next, what I wanted to move on to was basically our test cases. Let's see how much time we have. We have 51 seconds. I think I can explain that at 51 seconds. So basically, what I was trying to do with tests is use something called Jest, which is basically the platform Facebook uses to test all of its components and its site. So over here, we're testing our actions with Jest. And basically what Jest allows us to do, if we go to component, for example, it allows us to create snapshots of our component and then see if those snapshots match the components. So over here, we're shallow rendering, so we're only rendering on one level, the add expense page. And we're checking if this wrapper, which is the shallow rendering, is actually equal to the snapshot of add expense page. In other places, we're also changing the inputs. Let me just see if I can find them. These are just so what I was just explaining is that are like these are just mock functions, so they hide the actual implementation of the function, but they still allow us to see how they're called by other code and how they link to the rest of the code base. What I was trying to find is, oh, here, right here. So in some places, we're actually clicking buttons. So we're going to the button part of the component, and we're calling the onClick prop, and we're seeing if when we actually click the button, does it return or does it do the thing we actually want it to do? So right here, when we click the button, we want it to redirect us to our home page, which is exactly what this does. It expects us to go to the / route. And it also expects us to have like removed the expense with the appropriate ID. And expenses is just a fixture that I created. So I won't have to like keep importing the same exact data in every single file. So here's our fixtures. We have expenses. So this is basically the expenses we have, and then we're testing each one. And I'm trying to see if anything else is unique in these. So again, we have shallow rendering, mock functions, expecting the snapshots to be equal, seeing if the routes are appropriate, finding the appropriate part of the component, and then doing something on it and seeing if it returns or does the thing we want it to do. I explained that. Okay, we're just shallow rendering the component. Here we're testing, I think, the form, seeing if it sends out the appropriate actions. Okay, I think we're good with this. I think I explained most of like the fundamentals of Jest. And again, this could all be found on my GitHub, which I'll link later. So yeah, that's how I used Jest, using basically snapshots, mock functions, and going to specific parts of the component and seeing if it rendered it correctly using shallow rendering. And this is our second fixture. So we have expenses and filters as our second fixture, instead of having to import the data in every single test file. I could just say import filters from /fixtures /filters. You get what I mean. This is just a dummy test. Here we're setting up our tests, and our babel.rc or like git ignore. So we don't really want to add like the bundle.js, the map files for our styles inside our GitHub. And here's our package.json. So we have a lot of more dependencies in our second application than our first. And these are just our scripts. And our webpack config, which I explained before. And yeah, that's about all my application, which included Redux store components and testing the files using Jest. This will soon be uploaded to Heroku after I get the Firebase database working with it. So every time you refresh the page, it can save what you've done. And I might add user authentication later as well. So thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.